Would you accept a job that pays $3,000 for just 1 week, doing absolutely nothing but staying in an empty house? Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Now answer me honestly. What if the only rule was never, under any circumstances, to open a specific door in that house? Could you resist the curiosity? When Sarah Mitchell saw that online ad in September 2023, she was desperate. Newly divorced, drowning in medical debt, and in urgent need of money, the offer seemed like the answer to all her prayers. A temporary job as a caregiver in Portland, Oregon. Payment up front. No patient to care for. Just a quiet Victorian mansion that needed watching over for 7 days. Simple as that. Or at least that's what she thought. Sarah was a nurse, an experienced professional accustomed to dealing with emergencies and high-pressure situations. She wasn't the type to believe in superstitions or horror stories. But there are things in life that defy all our logic, all our rationality. And what happened in that house went far beyond any explanation Sarah could imagine. The mansion was imposing, hidden among ancient trees, with that heavy air that certain old buildings carry. The lawyer who hired her, a cold man with a penetrating gaze named Edmund Thorne, was straight to the point. Keep the house clean, don't receive visitors, and never open the basement door. It's locked for structural reasons, he said, with a firmness that left no room for questioning. Sarah signed the contract without a second thought. After all, what harm could there be in respecting such a simple rule? The first 48 hours were exactly as promised. Absolute silence, complete peace, almost boring. Sarah even thought it was too easy a job. But then came the third night, 3 in the morning, a hoarse whisper echoing off the walls of the room. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that something is wrong? That shiver down your spine. That tells you you're not alone. That's exactly what Sarah felt, and what she was about to discover in that silent mansion was no coincidence. It wasn't paranoia. It was a secret someone had tried to bury for decades, hidden behind that forbidden basement door. Stay with me until the end, because what the walls of that house were hiding will leave you speechless. Before I continue telling you what Sarah discovered that third night, I need to ask you something. You know when you watch something that really captivates you, that makes your heart race, that takes you out of your comfort zone. That's exactly the kind of connection I want to create with you here. And the truth is, your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who are also looking for real, intense stories that make us question the world around us. So, if you're feeling that connection, if this story has already hooked you in the first few minutes, leave a like now. I know it seems like a simple request, but each like shows me that this content makes sense to you, that it's worth continuing to bring you these narratives that keep us up at night. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button and activate the bell, because every week I bring you real stories like this one, which mix mystery, emotion, and that feeling of, I need to know what happened. And in the comments, tell me, would you have the courage to stay alone in that mansion? Would you respect the rule of not opening the basement door, or would curiosity get the better of you? I read all the comments, and I love knowing what's going through your minds. This exchange is what transforms this space into a true community of people who love a good story. Your voice matters here, your opinion matters, and the more people comment, like, and share, the more YouTube understands that this content needs to reach those who are truly interested in it. Now, back to Sarah and that third night that changed everything. That whisper coming from the walls at 3 in the morning was just the beginning of a journey Sarah never imagined she would live. But before we delve into what she found hidden in that mansion, you need to understand who Sarah Mitchell was and why she accepted such a strange job without asking further questions. Because the truth is that all of us at some point in our lives make decisions driven by desperation, by necessity, by that silent pressure that pushes us down paths we would normally avoid. Sarah was 34 years old and had a whole decade of experience as a nurse. She was the kind of professional everyone wants in the emergency room, calm under pressure, decisive, empathetic. But even the strongest people have their breaking points, those periods in life where everything seems to crumble at once. For Sarah, that moment arrived like a hurricane. Her 7-year marriage had ended a few months earlier, in that painful way where there's no villain. Just two people who grew in opposite directions. The divorce brought not only emotional pain, but also the financial burden of starting over alone. And then came the most devastating blow. Her mother, the woman who raised her alone after her father abandoned them when Sarah was only 5 years old, was diagnosed with cancer. The following months were a roller coaster of hope and despair, expensive treatments and medical bills that piled up like a relentless avalanche. Sarah used all her savings, took out loans, worked overtime until she was exhausted. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough when you're fighting a system that turns illness into debt. Her mother passed away in June 2023, and Sarah was left not only heartbroken, but with over $50,000 in hospital debt. It was in this context of forced transformation, of painful reconstruction, that Sarah saw that online ad one afternoon in September. $3,000 for a week's work. It seemed too good to be true, and all her life experience screamed that it probably was. But when you're drowning in bills you can't pay, when collection calls become part of your daily routine, when you start considering selling the car your mother left you just to breathe for another month, your mindset changes. You start considering options that previously seemed absurd. The ad was straightforward, seeking an experienced caregiver to look after a residential property for 7 days. There was no mention of a patient. No detailed description of the tasks. Just the address in Portland, Oregon, and a phone number for a law office. Sarah called that same afternoon, expecting it to be some kind of scam. But Edmund Thorne, the lawyer who answered, was professional and formal. He asked for references, verified her nursing license, inquired about her availability. Everything seemed legitimate, except for one detail that should have set off alarm bells in Sarah's head. There was no patient to care for. Just an empty house that needed watching. When Sarah questioned him, Thorne was evasive but convincing. He said it was a matter of family inventory, that the property was in the process of being sold, and they needed someone responsible to ensure everything remained in order. Payment would be up front, half before starting, half at the end of the week. Sarah knew there was something strange about that proposal, but desperation has a cruel way of blinding us to the red flags we would normally see from afar. She accepted the job on that same phone call, and 3 days later she was signing a confidentiality agreement and receiving the keys to that Victorian mansion that held secrets far darker than she could have imagined. When Sarah first arrived at that mansion on a grey September afternoon, she felt something she couldn't name. You know that instinctive feeling that warns us when something is out of place? That knot in the stomach that our ancestors developed to survive invisible predators? That was exactly it. The property was isolated in the suburbs of Portland, hidden behind a dense row of centuries-old trees that blocked almost all the sunlight. The driveway was long, covered in dead leaves that no one had swept in months, maybe years. And then, emerging from the shadows of the trees, there it was, a 3-story Victorian mansion, imposing and perfectly preserved, but carrying a heavy, almost oppressive air, as if the structure itself were tired of keeping secrets. The architecture was impeccable, the kind you see in historical design magazines. Tall windows with colourful stained glass, balconies decorated with wrought iron details, a tower in the right corner that gave the building a dark fairy tale aspect. But something was wrong. The windows were too clean for an abandoned house. The garden, though wild, showed signs of recent maintenance. It was as if someone wanted the house to look abandoned, but not enough to attract the attention of the authorities or curious neighbours. Sarah parked the car in front of the main entrance and sat there for a few minutes, just observing, trying to understand why her whole body was telling her to turn around and leave. Edmund Thorne was waiting at the door, punctual as promised. He was a tall man, probably in his 60s, in a dark suit with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. There was no warmth in that face, no trace of empathy or kindness. He treated the meeting like a cold business transaction, and in a way, that's exactly what it was. He handed Sarah a thick envelope containing the first half of the payment, a bunch of old keys, and a typed list of instructions. Yes, typed, as if it had been done decades ago and simply reprinted several times. That should have been another red flag, but Sarah was so focused on the money she held in her hands that she missed the detail. The instructions were simple and direct. Keep the house clean, don't receive visitors, don't use the library's landline, and under no circumstances open the basement door. Thorne repeated this last rule 3 times, looking Sarah directly in the eyes with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "It's locked for structural reasons," he said, in a voice that clung to no questioning. "The foundation in that area is compromised, and any additional weight could cause a collapse. It's dangerous. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, finding it strange that such a well-maintained house would have such serious structural problems in the basement. But she said nothing. She signed the contract, received the final instructions on where to find food and supplies, and then was left alone. The first 48 hours were surprisingly normal. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the wind rustling through the windows. Sarah explored the house during the day, marveling at the preservation of each room. There were original Victorian furnishings, Persian rugs that were probably worth a fortune, and dozens of framed photographs on the walls depicting generations of a family she didn't know. She cleaned, organized, and prepared her meals in the enormous modern kitchen that contrasted strangely with the rest of the antique decor. At night, she chose one of the bedrooms on the 2nd floor, away from the stairs leading to the basement, and slept peacefully, lulled by the silence that enveloped the property like a heavy blanket. But then came the 3rd night, and everything changed. Sarah woke at 3 in the morning to that hoarse whisper coming from the walls, and for the first time since she arrived, she understood that the silence of that house was not peace. It was waiting. Something was there, guarded, hidden behind that facade of normality, and that something was about to reveal itself in a way that would completely transform her understanding of what was real and what was possible. That mansion had a story to tell, and Sarah was about to become the first person in decades to truly hear it. If you're feeling this heavy atmosphere along with Sarah, if you have that chill down your spine wondering what comes next, subscribe to the channel now, because this journey is getting more and more intense, and you're definitely part of this discovery with me. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding so hard she could hear the pulse in her ears. 3 in the morning, the quietest hour of the night, when even the world seems to hold its breath. And it was precisely in that absolute silence that she heard a hoarse, muffled whisper coming from within the walls of the room. It wasn't clear words, a distinct voice, but there was something profoundly human in that sound, something desperate, something begging to be heard. Sarah froze for a few seconds, her rational nurse's mind trying to find a logical explanation. Old plumbing, wind through the cracks, animals in the house's structure, but her body, that primitive warning system inscribed in our DNA, knew it was something different. She slowly got up, turned on all the lights in the room and stood there, breathing deeply, trying to calm the panic that was rising in her throat. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that had taken its place was even more disturbing. It was a heavy, expectant silence, as if the whole house was watching to see what she would do next. Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to spend the rest of the night paralyzed by fear. She grabbed a flashlight, put a coat over her, pajamas, and began to search every room in the mansion, looking for the source of that sound. She checked the 3rd floor, then the 2nd, inspected every room, every hallway, every corner where something or someone might be hiding. Nothing. Absolutely nothing out of place. When the sun finally rose, Sarah was exhausted, but determined to find a rational explanation. She made a strong coffee in the kitchen and decided to do a thorough inspection of the house in the daylight. That's when she saw it. The basement door, the one Edmund Thorne had categorically ordered to remain closed, had fresh scratches in the wood. They weren't old scratches worn by time. They were recent, deep marks, as if human fingernails had desperately scraped the surface. And most disturbingly, the scratches came from inside the basement. Sarah knelt before the door, running her fingers over the marks, feeling her stomach churn. Something, or someone, was on the other side of that door and wanted to get out. It was in this moment of revelation that something shifted in Sarah's mindset. She began to pay attention to the details she had ignored in the early days, those small signs her brain had registered, but which she had consciously dismissed. The family photographs scattered across the walls of the house. Sarah had noticed they were beautiful, old, well-preserved. But now, looking more closely, she perceived something sinister. In several of them, the faces were scratched, not erased by accident or the wear and tear of time, but deliberately scratched with something sharp, as if someone wanted to erase those people from history. And always the same faces, a middle-aged woman with dark hair and kind eyes. In every photo where she appeared, her face was destroyed. There was also a strange smell that Sarah had attributed to the age of the house, a chemical odor mixed with mold coming from the pipes when she turned on certain taps. But now, following the smell, she realized it was stronger. Near the walls bordering the basement, it was as if something was leaking, seeping through the house's structure. And then came the discovery that made Sarah's blood run cold. In the second-floor hallway, where the morning light streamed through the window, casting shadows in the corners, she noticed a pattern in the cracks in the wall. They weren't random cracks caused by time. There was intention in those marks, a message hidden in plain sight. Sarah took a few steps back, adjusted her angle of vision, and the letters formed before her eyes with terrifying clarity. "Help me." Sarah wasn't superstitious. 10 years working in hospital emergency rooms had taught her that the world was governed by logic, science, cause and effect. She had seen people die, held hands in their final moments, witnessed the brutal fragility of human existence. None of that prepared her for what she was feeling at that moment. Her professional intuition, that sixth sense that nurses develop after years of reading vital signs and body language, was screaming that something was terribly, irremediably wrong in that house. And for the first time since she arrived, Sarah understood that she wasn't there by chance. That job, that excessively generous pay, that rule about never opening the basement. It was all part of something bigger, something that had been carefully planned. The question burning in her mind was, planned by whom? And for what purpose? Sarah could no longer pretend everything was normal. That message in the cracks in the wall, the scratches on the basement door, the nightly whispers, all of it had completely transformed her perception of that mansion. She was no longer there just to make money. She was at the center of something much bigger, something that demanded answers. And if there was one thing life had taught Sarah, it was that ignoring warning signs never ends well. So she did what any rational person would do in that situation. She started investigating. She grabbed her laptop, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of now-cold coffee, and typed the property's address into Google. What appeared on the screen made her heart race. The mansion had a history. And what a history! The property had belonged to the Whitmore family since 1890, passing from generation to generation as a legacy of wealth and prestige in the Portland community. The Whitmores were known as benefactors, owners of hospitals and clinics, respected figures in local society. But in 1974, something happened that forever tarnished the family name. Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch of the house at the time, disappeared without a trace. She was 42 years old, the mother of 2 grown children, and the wife of Charles Whitmore, a renowned doctor. And suddenly she vanished. The police were called, an investigation was opened, neighbors were questioned, but there were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of a crime. The case was officially closed 6 months later as voluntary. Abandonment of the home. Sarah clicked on link after link, absorbing every piece of information she could find. There were old internet forums where people from the region discussed the case, conspiracy theories, stories passed down by word of mouth over the decades. And it was in these forums that Sarah found something the police had never taken seriously. The rumors. Neighbors from that time reported hearing screams coming from the Whitmore mansion in the weeks leading up to Eleanor's disappearance, a woman crying, begging for help. But when the police checked, Charles Whitmore explained that his wife was experiencing mental health problems, anxiety attacks, episodes of paranoia. He was a doctor, an authority figure, a respected man. No one questioned his version of events, and Eleanor was never seen again. But Sarah knew there was more to the story. There had to be. She began exploring the house with the eyes of an investigator, searching for clues that might have been left behind. It was in the second-floor library, that room lined with old books smelling of mildew and forgotten wisdom, that she found the first real piece of the puzzle. There was a mahogany desk against the wall, covered in old papers and pens that had dried out decades ago. Sarah began opening the drawers one by one, looking for anything that seemed relevant. It was in the last drawer, the deepest one, that her fingers touched something strange. The wood at the bottom sounded hollow when tapped. It was a false drawer. Carefully, Sarah removed the false bottom and found an envelope yellowed with age, sealed with tape that no longer stuck. Inside, carefully preserved newspaper clippings, articles about Eleanor's disappearance, interviews with Charles Whitmore where he expressed his deep sadness at his wife's inexplicable departure. Photos of Eleanor smiling at social events, always beside her husband, always with that smile that now, in Sarah's eyes, seemed to carry an invisible weight. And then, at the bottom of the envelope, a handwritten note in trembling, almost illegible handwriting. "He locked me up. Nobody believes it. This house is my prison." It wasn't signed, but Sarah knew exactly who had written those words. Eleanor Whitmore had never abandoned her family. She had never left. At that moment, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of everything. Edmund Thorne's rules, the contract she had signed, the warnings about structural problems, none of that mattered anymore. A woman had pleaded for help for decades, her voice silenced by a system that chose to believe the powerful man instead of the desperate wife. And now, 50 years later, Sarah had the chance to give Eleanor what she never had in life. Someone who believed in her. Someone who broke the rules to seek the truth. Sarah looked at the locked basement door and felt a determination burning in her chest. She was going to open that door. It didn't matter what Thorne had said. It didn't matter the consequences, because some truths are too big to remain buried, and some secrets need to see the light of day, no matter how much time has passed. If you're on this journey of revelations with Sarah, if you feel this urgent need to discover what really happened to Eleanor Whitmore, subscribe to the channel now, because what Sarah finds behind that door will change everything you thought you knew about this story. Sarah spent the entire afternoon searching for a way to open that basement door. She tried all the keys from the bunch Thorne had left, but none worked. The lock was old, heavy, the kind that was made to never be easily opened. That's when Sarah remembered the garage. Every old house has a garage full of forgotten tools, instruments from a time when people fixed things themselves instead of calling professionals. And she was right. Among dusty boxes and furniture covered by tarps, Sarah found a rusty but still functional crowbar. With hands trembling from a mixture of fear and determination, she returned to that forbidden door. The wood groaned as Sarah wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame. She strained, feeling her arm muscles burn with the effort, and then heard the satisfying click of the lock giving way. The door swung open slowly, revealing complete darkness and a smell that immediately made Sarah recoil, covering her nose with her coat sleeve. It was a nauseating combination of decades of mold buildup, a burning, chemical odor in her nostrils, and beneath it all a decaying smell she knew all too well from her years working in hospitals. It was the smell of death, preserved by time in a closed space. Sarah took a deep breath, turned on her phone's flashlight, and began to descend. Each step of the wooden staircase creaked beneath her feet as if protesting the intrusion after so long. The descent seemed endless, much deeper than it should be for a typical basement. The temperature dropped with each step, and the dampness clung to her skin like a second cold, sticky layer. When Sarah finally reached the bottom, the flashlight illuminated a vast space with a low ceiling and stone walls covered in dark stains she preferred not to identify. There were stacked old boxes, broken furniture, all sorts of junk that families accumulate over generations. But Sarah wasn't interested in that. Her eyes were immediately drawn to something strange on the back wall. There was a vertical crack in the masonry, but it was too straight, too uniform to be natural. Sarah approached, ran her fingers along the surface, and felt a slight draft coming from the other side. It was a door, a false wall built to look solid, but which actually hid something behind it. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could feel her pulse throbbing in her temples. She pushed the wall and felt the structure give way. With a stronger push, an entire section of the wall moved, revealing a secret room that didn't appear on any of the house plans. And what Sarah saw inside made her fall to her knees, her hands trembling so much she almost dropped her cell phone. It was a small room, no bigger than a closet. The bare concrete walls were covered in deep scratches, desperate fingernail marks that had scraped the surface until it bled. Chains hung from the walls, rusty but still fastened with thick screws into the concrete. On the floor lay a thin mattress, stained and worn by time. And in a corner, partially hidden by rubble, Sarah saw bones. There weren't many, and they were partially covered by earth and debris, but they were unmistakably human. This had been a prison, and someone had died here, forgotten, alone, locked in the depths of their own home. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of the horror before her. Eleanor Whitmore had never abandoned her family. She had never left willingly. Her own husband had imprisoned her here, in this dark, damp hole, and left her to die. How long had Eleanor survived down here? Days? Weeks? Months? How long had she cried out for help before realizing no one would come? Sarah imagined the despair, the transformation of hope into resignation, and finally into acceptance of inevitable death. It was a cruelty so profound that it seemed impossible that one human being could inflict this on another, much less on someone they supposedly loved. But then Sarah saw something that changed everything again. In the opposite corner of the room, there was a hole in the wall, painstakingly carved into the concrete, and inside that hole, wrapped in plastic that had withstood the test of time, was a notebook. Sarah crawled over, picked up the object with reverent hands, and wiped the layer of dust from the cover. It was a diary, Eleanor Whitmore's diary. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink was still legible. Sarah opened to the first page and read, "If anyone finds this, please know that I did not leave of my own. Accord. My name is Eleanor Marie Whitmore, and my husband locked me in here. This is my story. This is my truth." And on the following pages, Eleanor had documented each day of her captivity, each horror Charles had committed, each dark secret she had discovered about the man who had sworn to love her until death. Sarah held that diary against her chest and knew that her journey was only beginning. Because now she held in her hands not only evidence, but Eleanor's voice, preserved through the decades, waiting for someone brave enough to finally listen to it. Sarah climbed up from the basement carrying the diary as if it were the most precious object in the world, because it was. Those yellowed pages contained not only the truth about Eleanor's disappearance, but the complete story of how a man respected by the community transformed into a monster before everyone's eyes. She sat at the kitchen table, turned on all the lights in the house because she couldn't stand the darkness any longer, and began to read. Each word was a punch to the gut. Each diary entry revealed layers of horror that Sarah could barely process. Eleanor had begun writing 2 months before her official disappearance, when she still had the freedom to document her findings. And what she discovered about Charles Whitmore was devastating. Eleanor wrote about how she had found documents in her husband's office, medical records of patients who shouldn't have been there. Charles was conducting illegal medical experiments on vulnerable people, psychiatric patients who no one would look for if they disappeared, homeless people who went unnoticed by society. He was testing experimental drugs, unapproved procedures, all in the name of research he believed would revolutionize medicine, but the human cost was terrifying. Eleanor discovered that at least 7 people had died as a direct result of Charles's experiments, and their bodies were never found. When she confronted her husband, threatening to go to the police and expose everything, Charles made a decision that would seal both their fate forever. The diary described in painful detail the months Eleanor spent imprisoned in the basement. Charles visited her irregularly, bringing just enough food and water to keep her alive. He tried to convince her that he was doing it out of love, that he couldn't let her destroy the family legacy, that eventually she would understand and they could go back to normal. But Eleanor knew the truth. Charles never planned to free her. He had spread the story that she had abandoned the family, that she was having an affair, that she had been seen in another city. And people believed it. Because Charles was a doctor, he was respectable, he was convincing. And Eleanor was just a hysterical wife, at least that's how he portrayed her. The last entries in the diary were almost illegible, written with weak and malnourished hands. Eleanor knew she was dying, and her last hope was that someone, someday, would find her words and finally believe her. Sarah also discovered something that explained the nightly whispers that had terrified her. They weren't ghosts or supernatural manifestations. The unique structure of the Victorian walls, combined with the way the basement had been built, created a strange acoustic effect. Air currents passing through cracks and old pipes generated sounds that were amplified and distorted, echoing through the house like muffled voices. It was science, not magic. But that didn't make the experience any less frightening, nor did it diminish the real horror of what had happened there. Sarah understood that the house wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by the truth, by a crime that had never been punished, by a voice that had never been heard. But there was one more shocking revelation waiting for Sarah between the pages of the diary. Eleanor had hidden documents along with her notes, copies of the medical records Charles kept in his office, proof of the illegal experiments. And stapled to the last page was an old photo showing 3 generations of the Whitmore family: Charles, his 2 sons, and a small child in the arms of one of the sons. On the back of the photo, written in trembling handwriting, "May God protect future generations from the evil that dwells in this family." Sarah took out her cell phone and began to research, connecting the dots. Charles's sons had changed their last name years after their father's death, trying to distance themselves from the scandal that never came to light. But the lineage was there, documented in public records, and when Sarah finally reached the current generation, her blood ran cold. Edmund Thorne was not only the lawyer responsible for the estate, he was Charles Whitmore's great-grandson. Everything made sense now. The strange job, the generous pay, the specific rule about not opening the basement. Edmund knew exactly what was hidden in that house, and he was testing, looking for someone. Curious enough, brave enough, or desperate enough to uncover the secret before the property was sold. Sarah found printed emails in Edmund's office, confirming her suspicions. He had hired at least 6 temporary caretakers in the last 2 years, always with the same instructions, always with the same rule about the basement. Sarah wasn't the first. She was just the first to actually open that door, and now that she knew the truth, she had to make the most important decision of her life. What to do with this information that could destroy an entire family but would finally bring justice to Eleanor Whitmore? If you're grasping the depth of this conspiracy, if you're understanding how secrets can be passed down through generations, subscribe to the channel, because the final confrontation between Sarah and Edmund will show you that some truths are too powerful to remain buried. Sarah knew she had too much evidence to simply ignore. Her hands still trembling from the discovery in the basement, she grabbed her phone and began photographing everything. Eleanor's diary, page by page, the medical documents proving Charles's illegal experiments, the secret room in the basement with the chains and scratches on the walls, the remains still there, forgotten for decades. Each photo was a piece of the puzzle that would finally reveal the whole truth. Sarah worked quickly, with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. Years dealing with hospital emergencies had trained her brain to function clearly, even when her heart was racing. She backed up all the photos to the cloud, sent copies to her best friend Rachel with a direct message. "If I don't call in an hour, take all this to the police. Seriously." When Sarah finally gathered all the evidence and prepared to leave the mansion, she realized she was no longer alone. The front door, which she was sure she had left unlocked, was now locked, and standing in front of her, blocking the only exit, was Edmund Thorne. The lawyer who had hired Sarah no longer wore that mask of cold professionalism. His face was tense, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Sarah's blood run cold. He knew. Obviously he knew. There were probably cameras in the house or sensors, some way of monitoring what was happening there. And Sarah had done exactly what he expected someone would eventually do. She had opened the forbidden door. "You shouldn't have gone down there," Edmund said, his voice low but laden with something dangerous. It wasn't anger exactly. It was resignation mixed with determination. "Do you understand what you've just done? My family has built a respectable legacy in this city. Generations of Whitmores have contributed to this community, hospitals, clinics, charities, and you want to destroy all of that because of something that happened 50 years ago?" Sarah gripped her cell phone tightly in her pocket, feeling the weight of Eleanor's diary in the bag she carried on her shoulder. She looked into Edmund's eyes and saw exactly what Eleanor must have seen in Charles's eyes decades ago, a man willing to do anything to protect his family's image, even if it meant hiding the most horrific truth. "Your great-grandfather killed your great-grandmother," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady, even as fear tightened her throat. "He locked her in the basement like an animal and left her to die alone and terrified. And you knew. You always knew. That's why you hire people to stay here, to see if anyone finds out before you sell the property and bury the secret forever." Edmund took a step toward Sarah, and she instinctively recoiled. "This secret dies with me," he said, with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "Just as it died with my grandfather and with my father. This is how we protect what we've built. You're not going to destroy decades of work because of a woman no one remembers." But Sarah had something Edmund hadn't expected. Experience. Handling life or death situations where every second counted. She had spent 10 years in emergency rooms, where the difference between saving a life and losing a patient often came down to staying calm and thinking strategically, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted her posture and looked at Edmund with a confidence that surprised even herself. "You're right about one thing," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "This secret isn't leaving this house today, because I've already sent all the evidence to my best friend. Photos from the diary, photos from the basement, documents, everything. And if I don't call her within the next 40 minutes to confirm I'm okay, she'll go straight to the police." Sarah saw the exact moment the information processed in Edmund's brain. The transformation in his expression was subtle but clear. Uncertainty, doubt, hesitation. He hadn't expected her to be so prepared, so strategic. Most of the other people he'd hired probably would have panicked, tried to run away, given him time to control the situation. But Sarah wasn't like the others. She dealt with violent husbands in the emergency room trying to prevent their wives from receiving treatment. She'd dealt with armed drug dealers demanding access to patients. She'd learned that sometimes the most convincing bluff is the one underpinned by a calm demeanor and a partial truth. Edmund hesitated, and in that split second of indecision, Sarah acted. She rushed to the side, pushing a coffee table into Edmund's path, and darted toward the living room's side window. She shattered the glass with her elbow, felt the shards tear her jacket but didn't care, and jumped out of the house. Her feet touched the damp grass of the garden, and she ran without looking back, running toward the main gate, while already dialing the emergency number on her cell phone. 911. What is your emergency? The operator's calm voice sounded like music to Sarah's ears. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I have just discovered evidence of a homicide on a property," she said, breathless as she ran. "Send police immediately. The suspect is here and tried to stop me from leaving." Sarah gave the address, and the operator confirmed that patrol cars were on their way. 20 minutes. The police would take 20 minutes to arrive. Sarah hid behind the trees surrounding the property, watching the house, waiting, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst from her chest. And for the first time in days, she felt something she hadn't felt since entering that mansion. Hope. Police sirens cut through the silence of the Portland suburb exactly 19 minutes after Sarah's call. 3 patrol cars arrived with flashing lights, followed by an ambulance that Sarah hadn't even requested, but that someone had the good sense to send. The police found Sarah hiding behind the trees, still clutching her cell phone tightly. And Edmund Thorne standing on the mansion's porch with a defeated expression. he had probably never experienced before. There was no chase, no drama. Edmund was too much of a lawyer to resist arrest. He knew when the game was lost. And at that moment, with Sarah alive, with the evidence already sent to third parties, with the police on the property, the secret his family had kept for 50 years was about to explode in a way that no lawyer in the world could contain. The ensuing investigation was swift and devastating. Police cordoned off the entire mansion as a crime scene. Forensic teams descended into the basement and found exactly what Sarah had photographed: the secret room, the chains, the scratches on the walls that told a story of despair and struggle. But there was more. Following the clues in the last pages of Eleanor's diary, investigators dug in the back garden of the property. And there, buried less than a meter deep under what had once been a rose bed, they found the complete remains of Eleanor Whitmore. Forensic analysis confirmed what Sarah already knew. Eleanor had died in captivity in 1974, likely from malnutrition and dehydration, after months of imprisonment. The official cause of death was recorded as homicide, and the case, which had been closed as voluntary abandonment, was officially reopened as murder. Edmund Thorne was arrested and charged with multiple crimes: obstruction of justice for concealing evidence of a homicide for decades, concealment of a corpse, attempted witness intimidation, and as the investigation deepened, more charges surfaced. Police discovered that Edmund wasn't just protecting the family secret, he was actively profiting from it. The temporary caregivers he hired over the years weren't random tests. Edmund was using these people to systematically clean up any evidence that might have been left behind, paying well enough to ensure silence, but never imagining that anyone would be brave enough to actually defy his orders and open that forbidden door. The story exploded in the Portland media like a bomb. Headlines about the Whitmore family dominated newspapers for weeks. 50-year-old secret revealed in Victorian mansion. Respected doctor was a murderer. New evidence reopens cold case. The impact was profound not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of how it had been hidden in plain sight for so long. The transformation in public perception of the Whitmore family was immediate and brutal. Hospitals and institutions bearing the family name began removing plaques, distancing themselves from the legacy now forever tarnished. And more importantly, Eleanor's story opened doors to dozens of other cases that had been shelved or ignored over the decades. Families who had lost loved ones in mysterious circumstances related to Charles Whitmore finally had their suspicions validated. Police reopened at least 20 cases, searching for other victims of the illegal medical experiments that Eleanor had documented in her diary. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm of attention she never asked for and definitely didn't want. Reporters camped out in front of her apartment. Documentary producers called offering money for exclusive interviews. She was called a heroine, a champion of justice, a courageous woman who gave voice to the silenced. But Sarah didn't feel like a heroine. She felt exhausted, emotionally drained, and deeply saddened for Eleanor. All Sarah truly wanted was for Eleanor to finally have the peace that had been denied her in life, and that's what she fought to secure. After months of legal battles and bureaucratic procedures, Eleanor Whitmore's body was finally released by the police for a proper burial. Sarah personally organized the ceremony, using some of the reward money she received for helping solve a murder case that had remained unsolved for 49 years. Eleanor was buried next to her parents in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Portland, under a centuries-old tree that offered shade and peace. The headstone Sarah commissioned was simple but powerful. Eleanor Marie Whitmore, 1932-1974. Her voice was silenced, but her truth was finally heard. A few dozen people attended the ceremony, mostly strangers who had been touched by the story and wanted to pay their respects. Sarah stood there, watching the coffin being lowered into the ground, and felt something she hadn't expected: closure. Not just for Eleanor, but for herself as well. That journey through the dark backstage of the Whitmore mansion had changed Sarah in ways she was still processing. And with the money left over from the reward, she paid off all the hospital debts that had suffocated her for so long and finally had the chance to start over, to rebuild her life on more solid foundations this time. If you're feeling the weight of this belated justice, if you're realizing how one person's courage can finally give a voice to those who have been silenced, subscribe to the channel now, because the conclusion of this story will show you the true legacy that Eleanor and Sarah left for all of us. 6 months after Eleanor Whitmore's funeral, Sarah sat in her new apartment, smaller but cozy, free from the debts that had haunted her for so long. She gazed out the window at the city of Portland, stretching out before her, reflecting on everything that had happened. The transformation she had undergone was not merely financial or circumstantial. It was something deeper, a fundamental shift in how she saw the world and her place in it. Sarah had entered that Victorian mansion as a desperate woman, fleeing from problems, accepting any opportunity that came her way without question. She left as someone who understood the power of questioning, of trusting her intuition, of not accepting convenient silences when something cries out for justice. The story of Sarah and Eleanor forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the world we live in. The walls around us, whether literal or metaphorical, hold much more than bricks and cement. They hold secrets, truths that someone decided were too inconvenient to reveal. They hide voices that have been silenced by power, by fear, by social convenience. How many other Eleanors exist at this very moment? How many people are crying out for help in ways we choose not to hear because it's easier to believe the official version, the story told by those who have authority and respect? Reality is that we live in a society that often values reputation over truth, that protects institutions instead of individuals, that prefers to keep secrets buried rather than face the discomfort of painful revelations. Sarah Mitchell wasn't a detective. She had no special training in criminal investigation. She possessed no superpowers or extraordinary abilities. She was just an ordinary woman, a nurse going through a difficult time in her life, who accepted an odd job out of desperation. But what made her extraordinary was a simple decision. When her intuition screamed that something was wrong, she chose to listen. When the signs appeared, she chose to pay attention. When the forbidden door presented itself before her, she chose to open it, even knowing there would be consequences. And that choice, that willingness to question and investigate instead of simply obeying, made all the difference. Sometimes bringing justice to the world doesn't require extraordinary skills. It only requires ordinary courage applied at the right moment. The legacy of this story goes far beyond a murder case solved 50 years later. Eleanor Whitmore has become a symbol in Portland and beyond, representing all the silenced voices still waiting to be heard. Her story inspired real change. The city implemented new protocols for reviewing archived missing persons cases, especially those involving women who were quickly dismissed as voluntary abandonment. Women's rights organizations used the case to highlight how often victims are not believed when they accuse men in positions of power. And Sarah, despite having shunned most of the spotlight, has become an active voice in online communities, investigating unsolved cases, sharing her experience, and encouraging others to trust their instincts when something doesn't seem right. Whitmore Manor was demolished 6 months after the investigation concluded. Edmund Thorne had exhausted all legal avenues to keep it standing, and the town decided it was best to erase that physical symbol of horror. In its place, a small memorial park was built with a garden of white roses, Eleanor's favorite flowers, according to her diary. A simple plaque tells the story in broad strokes, ensuring that no one forgets what happened there. Sarah visits the park sometimes, usually alone on Sunday mornings when there are fewer people. She sits on one of the benches under the trees and thinks about decisions, about how a choice can completely alter the course not only of one life but of many. She thinks about how Eleanor spent her last days writing that diary, holding on to the hope that someone someday would find her words and finally believe her. And that hope was not in vain. What this story teaches us, ultimately, is about the impact a person can have when they decide that truth matters more than convenience. It teaches us that delayed justice is still justice, and that no voice should be silenced simply because it is inconvenient. For those in power, it teaches us to pay attention to the whispers that come from behind the walls, to the stories that are only half told, to the questions that no one wants to ask. And most importantly, It teaches us that each of us has the power to make a difference when we choose not to ignore our intuition, when we decide that some doors need to be opened, no matter who told us to keep them closed. If you've made it this far with me, to the end of this intense journey that began with a forbidden door and ended with justice that took 50 years to achieve, I want you to know that this means a lot. These stories aren't easy to tell, and they're definitely not easy to listen to until the end, but you stayed. You connected with Eleanor, you rooted for Sarah, and you understood that behind every silent house, every well-kept secret, there's a truth waiting to be revealed. If this type of content resonates with you, if you enjoy real stories that move us, that make us question and think beyond the obvious, subscribe to the channel. Every week I bring you narratives like this, real cases that show the complexity of human beings and the importance of never stopping asking questions. And leave a like below, because every like shows me that this research work, this careful and respectful construction of these narratives, is worthwhile. In the comments, write "Justice for Eleanor" if you made it to the end and felt the weight of this story. I read all the comments, and I love knowing what you think, what connections you make with your own experiences. Your voice here matters as much as Sarah's mattered in that mansion. And look, there's a video over here that you need to see. It's about another case that went unsolved for decades until someone ordinary like you and me decided they deserved answers. Click and continue with me there, because the story doesn't end here. It never ends until the next case. And always remember, trust your intuition.